Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Doug. I'm one of the pastors here at LifeSpring. And first off, I want to say how much I appreciate Josh sharing that with us. I think there's so much truth in that. I think that's such an important thing for us to hear right now. And then also, I want to let you guys know I'm so appreciative to actually be here with you this morning. I wasn't able to be here last weekend. I was out of town. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So this is my first weekend back here in the building. And I really appreciate that. I've been thinking about that this week because, we tell you guys all the time that a building is not the church. We are the church. The people are the church. And so when the people of God gather together, there's power in that gathering. And it's just so refreshing for me to be part of a gathering like that again this morning. And so I really appreciate you guys being here. And, part of that power really comes from the fact that when we gather together, we're gathering for a real common purpose, a deep common purpose, which is why I think the fact that we're doing a series right now called Common Purpose is very timely, at least one of the reasons. Another reason is that we've got some things going on as a church right now that we're trying to come together on a common purpose. I'm not sure if you've heard, but we do have a little project that's almost done down the street in our new building in the community commons for a place to worship together, a community center that's open throughout the week, an early learning center and preschool, and a coffee shop. And that's not to mention what we're doing here in this building once we move. And so God has really given us a big vision. He's given us a real common purpose to rally around. And so we want to make sure that we are fully engaging in that purpose. I really appreciate, trust me, we're so excited for what's going on right now, even though that the image of it might be a little different than we imagined with everything going on in 2020 for a move-in time. But I so appreciate how everyone has been stepping up in so many ways. You guys have stepped up in prayer. You have stepped up in your giving. You've made this a possibility. And so this Common Purpose series is largely about that one last thing we want to make sure we're doing to step up to make this a reality, which is to serve together in that common purpose. Because we don't want to have put all of this into this and then not see the fullness of what God has for the goodness into this community that comes back out of it through the common purpose of living together and serving together side by side. And so that's been largely what this series is about, but this series has also been an opportunity for us to go through a number of parables from the book of Matthew. And these parables really strongly relate to what we have been talking about. If you aren't familiar with what a parable is a story that is told specifically to illustrate a truth or truths. And so parable is a kind of method that Jesus uses a lot. And I think the reason he uses it is story is kind of the universal human language. We all speak and think and experience in story, and story is something we can all relate to. And so I think overall, parables are something that people tend to gravitate to in the Bible. We like the parables. We remember the parables. We tend to go to the parables. However, there's one that's kind of an exception, and it happens to be the one that we're doing this morning. I think this is a parable that a lot of people actually run from. And it's because there's some parts of it that make them a little bit uncomfortable. And I think it's because we tend to skim over the surface, like a stone skipping on the surface of the water, because we don't know if we really like what it's saying at first glance. But I want to challenge us with this morning is to let ourselves sink down into this parable, because I think the truths that we're going to find in there are very good news, and they're things that we need to know and understand. And I think they're very important to our common purpose that we're talking about in this series. And so the parable we're going to be looking at is in the book of Matthew. It's chapter 22. It's basically the first half of the chapter. And for this one, what I'm going to end up doing is just going ahead and we're going to read through it kind of verse by verse. And I'm just going to talk about what's going on. We're just going to kind of work through it slowly and discuss what's happening as we go. And then we're going to talk about why this is so applicable to us, particularly right now. So it's going to be pretty straightforward. If you've got your Bibles, you can grab it. Also, it's printed right on the bulletin insert, almost the entire passage. So if you want to read and go through it that way as well. So I'm just going to jump in. Starting in verse 1, it says, And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables. So we know it's a parable because he just told us it was, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son and sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast." Okay, so I want to stop right off the bat and just look at that first few phrases where it says, the kingdom of heaven may be. So it's, again, what is a parable? A parable is a story that illustrates a specific truth. And so right away, we find out that this parable is illustrating the kingdom of heaven. And so our first question should be, what's the kingdom of heaven? And I think when we say that, most people's first image of the kingdom of heaven is a place that we go to when we die. And that explanation I want to challenge because I think that definition is woefully insufficient in actually two different ways. First, we just mentioned the church is not a building, the church is the people. Well, it's very similar when we talk about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is not just some place we go when we die. It's the people. It's life with God. It's us living together in that common purpose. And so that is similar to what we talk about with the church in that it is not just a place. It is our experience, our life, our time with God. And then also, it's not just something that happens when we die. The kingdom of heaven comes into its fullness in how we experience it after we die, yes, but the kingdom of heaven is here. The kingdom of heaven is now. And that is not some dramatic prophetic statement. That is an actual biblical truth that we need to understand. And it's not to say that there isn't pain, there isn't suffering, there isn't difficulty. Just because we think of heaven as perfection doesn't mean that the kingdom isn't present here and with what we're doing. And so it is our common purpose. And so that's important because we need to know, what is this story talking about? Well, it's illustrating that. It's illustrating the kingdom of heaven. And then it says that it is like a king who gives a wedding feast for his son. Now, if this parable ended with that first sentence, it would actually be a pretty cool parable. It would be a pretty cool image or analogy for us, because what is a king's wedding feast like? So first off, it's a king. We're not talking about like a welfare Christmas kind of wedding feast party going on here. We're talking about a king for his son. So this is lavish. This is big. This is a celebration. And a wedding feast at its core is a celebration. It is a party, but it's not an aimless party for no reason. It's a party with purpose. It's a celebration for a good reason. There's depth, and there's good food, and there's enjoyment, and there's joy that comes from a wedding feast. And so to think of the kingdom of heaven like a feast at a king's wedding banquet, that's a pretty cool image right from the get-go. That's a pretty positive thing. However, the question from there becomes, well, how does this work? What does that look like? And it goes on to tell us, and it talks of the king. It says that he sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. So again, here we see the first kind of twist in the story. Makes sense. The king is throwing his wedding feast, so he's got his invitation list, and he sends out his invites, but people don't come. Now that's surprising to us, because if we were invited to a royal wedding, I think we'd all probably try and go if we had any possibility to go. But it's even more shocking in this context, because you didn't just ignore or dismiss an invitation from a king in the first century. It was something you only did under the utmost severity and for the biggest, strongest reasons. And so this is really kind of a shocking twist to this story, because this is not how people normally would have reacted. And so the next question is, okay, so what does the king do next? And something we need to understand in the context of what we're reading is that we're reading about the first century. And in the first century, they did wedding invitations a little different than we do. We send out a wedding invitation, it goes up on the fridge. That's our invitation to, Cousin Billy's wedding, and we're going to go to that. And sometimes people will send out sort of a save the date. Well, in the first century, the save the date was a much bigger deal, and the main invitation that we just read about is actually more like we would call a save the date, because they would send out an invitation that would say, you're invited to the party, come hang out with us, we're going to have a big feast, this is what's happening, this is when and where it's happening. And that was the first invitation. But because travel could be tricky, because if something went wrong, it wasn't as easy to fix in short notice as we have in our culture today, there was a second invitation that would go out historically right before the event was going to happen. And that invitation would say, hey, everything is ready, we're good to go, you can start your travel, you can execute your plans. And so that was the second invitation. And so what we see in verse 4 is that that's exactly what the king does. He says, and again, he sent his other servants saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatted calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. And so now we see an even bigger twist on the story. Not only is an invitation ignored, but a second invitation is both blatantly ignored, and the servants who are sent by a good king simply to invite his people to a party, to a feast, those servants with that good news are captured and harmed and killed. And so that is meant to be as unimaginable as it sounds, for that to be the situation. And I want to point out here that even though this is a story, Jesus is choosing his words very carefully. For example, he says that one goes off to his farm and one off to his business. And that, we can kind of glance over the word his there in the English. But what we have to remember again is in the context, in that time, if you're talking about a king and his subjects who are being invited, property was largely considered the property of the king, and people were granted property by the leave of the king. But here it's very specific in the Greek where he's saying his farm, his business. And so what you see here is a king who has granted these good things to his people, who is inviting them to a party, but they instead are saying, no, I'm going to lay claim to what was rightfully yours in the first place, and I'm going to make it mine, and I'm going to just stay with this. I don't want what you have to offer, and I'm going to take what you've already given and claim it as my own. And then you have those who mistreat and kill the servants. And so what we have to understand as we move forward, because verse 7 is where this starts to get uneasy for some people. Now, I think for the modern reader, verse 7 isn't as difficult as it was for the reader or the listener that was there, it was present when Jesus was giving this story. So as we look at what the king's response is, what I want you guys to remember is that Jesus is telling this story to first century Jews. In fact, there are many Pharisees in this crowd. We know that because just after this story, these Pharisees are going to go off and plot against Jesus. And they're going to do it largely because of what he's about to say the king's going to do when he says what's in verse 7. So let's see what the king's response to his servants being captured is. And it says, the king was angry. Okay, well, duh. That should be a pretty obvious statement. I think I'd be ticked off too if you killed my servants because I wanted you to come to a wedding for my child. And it says, and he sent his troops and destroyed the murderers and burned their city. Okay, a couple of things. As the modern reader, God seems a little bit judgmental and angry, and we don't like that side of God when we read it. But for us, this isn't too challenging because all we have to do is read it in the context of the earlier 6 verses, and God doesn't seem so mean. After all, these are people who seized his servants, who he was sending just to invite them for something good, killed them. God is issuing justice here. But if you just read verse 7, he sounds like a big meanie. And so when we look at this, though, when we look at it in the context of the first century, of the people who were listening to this story, here's what you have to understand. The Jewish people knew God is the king. They knew that image. They understood. Jesus is very blatant that God in this story is the king. But the Jews also knew very inherently their identity was as God's chosen people. They knew they were the people on the invitation list. They knew they were the ones Jesus is accusing of grabbing the servants who are coming simply to proclaim a genuine invitation to come to God's party, and that they were mistreating him, that they were taking the law of God, the character of God, and they were turning it into their religion, and that they were making it into their farm that they were going to stay with, and they weren't going to come to the real party, that they were seizing the servants that God was sending to tell them what they were doing was wrong and to invite them to something better, and they were harming and killing them. And this is not only true of their history, this is true in the sense that it was prophetic, because not long after this, Jesus, who came as the suffering servant, would be captured and mistreated and tortured and killed by these same people who are angry at him for saying that's what they're doing. Not only that, it says that their city would be destroyed. In less than 50 years after Jesus tells this parable, the Romans would come into Jerusalem and scatter the Jewish people and tear down the temple. And so there is a sense of prophetic statement in this parable, as well as the truth of the history of what was going on. And so that was the reason that the Pharisees and those listening were so angry with verse 7. But for us, the next question is, well, what's the king going to do now? Because no one is coming to his son's wedding feast. And it says, then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so that the wedding hall was filled with guests. Now, this is the part of the story we love. This is a great part of the story, and it's an important part of the story. The fact that God said, those who will reject my invitation, I will open this invitation to everyone. Again, we see this in the early church. We see that as Christ has come and suffered and sacrificed and died, the wedding feast. By the way, Christ is a servant, but he is also the son in this story. It is the celebration of his wedding. It is the celebration of his union with his people, the opportunity we now have to celebrate with God. And so, as that comes into place, God says, this is open to everyone. Those who were invited largely rejected the invitation. So now the invitation is both to Jew and to Gentile. And so we see this opening up in this part of God's heart where he's reaching out and this generosity of inviting everyone to this grand feast. And, honestly, it would be really good if this parable ended right here. It would be easy for all of us. That's a great parable. We wouldn't feel that uneasy with it. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. And so there's an important part, and this is the part I want you guys to hang with me on, because this is the part of the parable that people struggle with the most. It's verses 11 to 14, and it's the part that people don't like the image, but I promise you, if you dig into it, you're going to find that it isn't exactly what it looks like on the surface. It says, but when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. By the way, that's not only a cool response, it's actually very important. Then the king said to his attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness, in the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. Now, I got to be honest, the reason I think we don't like those verses is because at first glance, it really does make God look capricious and petty and mean. We get it with the first group. We understand, okay, you gave them all this good stuff, and then you sent these servants to simply invite them to something great, and here they're killing your servants. We can kind of understand serious retaliation there. But the idea that somebody said, oh, I'm invited to the party, okay, walked in, and now, oh, well, you're just not wearing the right clothes, so we're going to throw you out onto the street where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That sounds way too harsh. That sounds like God needs me to be legalistic and check every little box as I go along the way. But that's not actually what's happening here. And we can cue in on that response by the guy in the story who had no response to the question. I did a little digging on it even afterwards last night, and I saw that what it's saying there, we usually translate it as speechless, but there's this idea that the guy just had nothing to say. He had no retort. He had no viable response. That's kind of what's being communicated there. Now, if you're talking about a person who's invited and couldn't afford the clothes or didn't know about the dress code, or those people have a response. This is someone who decided not to put on wedding clothes. And we like to think of this as, oh, well, you got to put on the outfit and you got to check all these boxes, and that's being God legalistic. Again, it's not. As we read in Scripture, we find out more about what those clothes are. It tells us later on that we are to put on Christ. The reason this guy had no response is because if he had said, I couldn't afford the clothes, the king would have given him the clothes. Just as the king provided the food, just as the king has provided everything. We know that God in this story is the king, and he provides. He's already done that. Christ has already been the sacrifice. But yet we still have to put the clothes on. He's calling us not to simply pick and choose. He's calling us completely into the invitation. And the reason that the punishment for this guy is so harsh is because he's doing something far more serious. He's coming in and he's saying, well, okay, great. I like the idea of a party. I'll have this good food, but I don't want to change. I've been told my whole life I'm a precious little snowflake. My mommy told me, my teacher told me, everybody told me this, and I don't have to change because God loves me just the way I am. And what's dangerous there is there's a truth and a lie in that both. Because God loves all of us right where we are, no matter what we've been through, no matter what. He loves us. But he loves the people who were cast out of the party just like he loves the people who are at it. The difference is the call to put on Christ, to fully accept the invitation. That's the difficult part of the truth of the good news of the gospel. But it's also important because if you don't do that, that's where you get buffet line Christianity. That's where you get pick and choose. That's where you get hypocrisy. And what that guy's really clinging to is not beautiful snowflake originality. It's actually the same old dissent and selfishness. The real beauty, the real originality, the real truth of who you are comes in putting on the wedding clothes. It's not a uniform. It's something uniquely made for each and every one of us in the putting on of Christ to become who we really are. And so this guy should have been putting on those clothes. And he knew it. And that's why he's thrown out. Now, we've gone through the entirety of this story, and we've talked about it in the terms of the way that it's normally talked about, the characters of those who are invited to the wedding, and how God responds. But there's a character or some characters that appear in this story over and over again that I see that get glanced over that I want to finish by narrowing in on today. And that's because we actually fill the shoes of three different characters in this story. We are obviously, and when I say we, I mean those who are part of the church who've accepted that invitation. We are those people in the story that have accepted the invitation to come to the wedding. We're also an unnamed character in the bride in the story because we know from Scripture that the church is the bride of Christ, who is the son in this story. But then lastly, we're also the servants. Christ was a suffering servant, but so are we. He talks about multiple servants in this story. We are called as guests also to be servants. And I want to point something out to you guys in how the king invites in this story. He doesn't put up a giant billboard that says wedding feast, everybody come. God didn't put a big sign in the sky that says everyone's invited, come to the party. What the king does is he sends his servants. We've been talking about the importance of the servants throughout this series. And we've been focused on what the servants do, like setting the table. And that's an important part even in this story, even if it's not talked about. The servants are setting the table. They're preparing things. They're doing things for the sake of this feast. But the servants are also the ones that are inviting people. And so for this week, I wanted to narrow in on this because we're talking about all the different things we can do to prepare the rest of the course of this series. But I don't want to miss one of the major calls that we're called to as a servant, which is to invite others to the feast. That's how people get there. You know, and it's a hard call. Because for some of us, we're introverts, or we don't want to do that, or it's difficult. And I'm not saying that everyone has to be a street evangelist on the corner just inviting loudly and talking to everyone. But every one of us is called to invite to this feast because it's how the guests know to come. It's absolutely critical. I want to ask you guys a hard question. When was the last time in all of the serving that you've done, perhaps here, that you've invited someone to the feast? And here's the other thing. That might sound difficult, but there's a good news piece. It's not easy, but there's a great news piece about this. And that is that this is an invitation to a party. Right? It's not an invitation to something that's obnoxious and we shouldn't want to invite people to. And I'm not saying you should never invite someone even when you don't feel like it because God's calling you to, but I am saying we should have a sense of excitement about inviting people to the party because it's such a good time. Have you ever met somebody who's really excited to go to a party? Who's like, you got to come, man. You got to come to this party. It's fantastic. And you're like, what's going on at the party? You know, what's happening? And maybe they know a few answers, but they may not even have a clue a lot of the details. Like, I don't know, but come on. It's great. We'll figure it out. Come on. I think a lot of us don't want to invite people to the party because we don't think we have enough information. We don't know if we can answer all their questions. But if we're excited about going to a party, that doesn't matter. We admit when we don't have the answer, and we focus on the part that we know. And we search for the answers because we know it's a party worth going to. I wanted to finish this morning by telling you a quick story about something that happened to me last week. As I mentioned, I was out of town. I went out of town with two of my buddies, both good Christian guys, though neither of them go to LifeSpring. And we were out of town. We're just kind of hanging out for the weekend, fellowshipping. And last Saturday, in the middle of the day, we were sitting around talking, and we were in a cigar lounge. And I'd gone up to the counter to talk to the guy there who knew a lot about the city and those kinds of things. As I'm there, this young man who's on the screen came walking in. And he just looked out of place because he didn't know what he was doing. He was just looking around confused. And the guy behind the counter asked him, well, can I help you? What are you here for? And he said, I've never tried a cigar before. I don't know what to do. And the guy behind the counter said, well, just look around, do your thing, and come on back, and I'll have something I'll recommend for you. And so I went back and sat down with my buddies, and I saw him come back up to the counter, and I told them what I'd heard him say, and I said, we should invite him over. So this young guy came and he sat down and we just started talking together. And the two guys I was with, they have a very strong evangelistic heart. It didn't take long for us to be talking about our faith a little bit and who we were. And he lit up. He's like, I was raised in a Christian house and my mother is very devoted and I was at one point. He just kind of had been disconnected from the church. And he started telling us his story. And this was a kid who was just hurting. He was just really deeply hurting. At one point, my buddies left just so that the two of us could talk, so that he felt more comfortable. And he told us all about how, he had grown up in St. Louis in a single-parent household, and he had decided to move after his father had been murdered because he wanted to try and raise a family in a neighborhood that wasn't so dangerous. And he brought his girlfriend and his girlfriend's daughter, who called him dad, down. But after a couple of weeks, they decided they didn't want to be there, and she, through some mean things, just left and completely left him there. And he had a job, but nothing else in the area. And he was just wondering what to do, and he was so grateful just to sit and to talk and to have fellowship with other guys. And what struck me is he kept saying, I've never had fun like this before. I've never just sat here calmly and had fun like this before. And what he was getting at is he was telling us about how he had gotten into kind of a party scene. And he was going to parties, but the parties he was going to, the fun wasn't deep. It was shallow. And so if he told about his sorrows or he talked about his grief, it would ruin the vibe and the party wouldn't be good anymore. But instead with us, what he was trying to communicate was the idea that he could sit with us and he could say, I'm hurting, I'm struggling, this is a really hard time for me. And we could sit there and we could talk to him and we could say, yes, that pain is real. Yes, that suffering is real. No, we don't have to diminish it. We don't have to even try because we know there is a joy and we know there is a purpose, a common purpose that is so much deeper and a feast that is available that doesn't eliminate the suffering of this world while this world exists, and yet it is so much greater that it makes it all seem small in comparison. And we can actually listen and you can tell us about your hard time, and 3 minutes later we can be laughing about a joke because it didn't ruin everything. Because you're not escaping to try and have fun. You are coming to the King's feast in a true and genuine invitation, secure in that invite. And so that was so great for us because of that joy. And I wanted to share that with you because it was a joy for us to do that. It was a joy for him. In fact, the last day we were there, we invited him back out the next day, and he got his phone out, and he click, 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 and he goes, hi, Mama. And he turned it around. He's like, I want you to meet my friends, because his mom had been the spiritual influence that had invited him in the first. And he wanted her to know he had found guys who were inviting him to the same thing, and that it was helping, and that there was a sense of joy. And he was excited to share that with his mom. And it was a blessing for us to have that experience. Now, I just want to challenge you as we finish and as the band comes back up, that I want you guys to be able to respond to this. We have a number of things that you guys can be doing. The first thing is, I want all of us to recognize that there is a deep, abiding joy in the invitation. To remember that we're being called to a feast, to a banquet, and not just to tick boxes in a legalistic faith. The second thing is, if you've never come to the feast, if you've never accepted that invitation, don't wait. Come and talk to Jeff or myself or Caleb or somebody today. We would love to talk to you more about what it means to come to the feast through Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. And then finally, if you are somebody who's a part of the feast, find a way to serve. Maybe that's to give financially into the kingdom. You can give online or through the app, through LifeSpring, into God's kingdom. Or perhaps it's to consider the insert in this bulletin. I want to encourage you guys, even if you're already serving in a role here, maybe you can increase the amount of time in that role or do another one, even if for a short period. We're going to have new people over at that new building, and we're going to want them to have the opportunity to serve as well. But there's got to be a way for us to make sure that everything is properly in place, even for a short time. So I want to encourage you to think about committing to serve extra for a couple of months perhaps, so that we can continue to build up an opportunity to serve those who are going to have an opportunity to turn around and serve even more people. And so think about checking off what's on there. And thank you guys so much for what you've already done. Now I want to turn it over to the band and just have the opportunity to praise the God who's invited us to a feast.